In September 1928, three men met at Achnacarry Castle in the Scottish Highlands. One represented Royal Dutch Shell. One represented Anglo-Persian oil. The company Britain had bought a controlling stake in days before WI began. And one represented Standard Oil of New Jersey, the American company that had once been part of John D. Rockefeller's empire. They were ostensibly there for grouse hunting. What they actually did would control the global oil supply for the next 50 years. What they signed that weekend became known as the Achnacarry Agreement, or, in the language of the oil industry, the As-Is Agreement. The logic was simple and brutal. Competition between the major oil companies was wasteful. It drove down prices, created instability, and reduced profits. The solution was to freeze market share exactly as it stood in 1928. No company would expand at the expense of another. Prices would be coordinated. Supply would be managed. It was a cartel in everything but name. To understand how we got to that Scottish castle, you have to go back to the war. When WE ended, Britain and France moved immediately to lock in their control of Middle Eastern oil through the League of Nations mandate system. Iraq, modern Iraq, became a British mandate. Syria and Lebanon became French. These were not colonial accidents. They were oil strategies wearing the clothing of governance. But there was a problem. The United States had fought in WWE, American companies had supplied most of the oil that won it, and now Britain and France had carved up the Middle Eastern spoils without giving America a single concession. Washington was furious. American oil executives went directly to the State Department, and the State Department sent a young lawyer, Allen Dulles, to legally dismantle the Anglo-French monopoly and force the American companies in. Dulles argued that the original oil concession agreements in Mesopotamia, made with the Ottoman Empire, were legally void because the Ottoman Empire no longer existed. The entire legal framework Britain and France had built their claims on was, in his reading, a fiction. It was an audacious argument, and it worked. By the mid-1920s, American oil companies had been granted entry into the Middle Eastern Oil Consortium. The question now was how to stop them all from destroying each other, and that answer was Achnacarry. In July 1928, 2 months before Achnacarry, the same parties had reached a different agreement, this one specifically about the Middle East. It became known as the Red Line Agreement, and the name is literal. Calouste Gulbenkian, the Armenian oil broker who had helped found the Turkish Petroleum Company before WWE, sat at a negotiating table, picked up a red crayon, and drew a line around the former Ottoman Empire on a map. Everything inside that line would be developed jointly. No company could pursue oil independently within it. Gulbenkian himself became famous for a clause he insisted on: 5%. He negotiated a permanent 5% stake in all oil production within the Red Line. For himself, personally, he was known from that day as Mr. 5%. He never ran a country. He never commanded an army. He just sat in rooms where agreements were made and made sure his name was on everyone. He died in 1955, still collecting his 5%. Now, why did the Red Line Agreement matter so much? Because it didn't just divide existing oil fields. It prevented any of the signatory companies from pursuing oil independently across an enormous stretch of the world's most oil-rich territory. If one company found a new field inside the Red Line, every other partner had to be included. This effectively killed competition before it could start, and it meant that no Middle Eastern government, no Arab king, no Persian minister, could negotiate with just one Western company. They had to deal with the cartel as a bloc. The Red Line Agreement was kept secret, not from the oil companies, they all knew, but from the governments of the countries whose resources were being carved up, and from the public in the West, who might have had opinions about private companies claiming sovereign rights over the natural resources of entire nations. Secrecy wasn't a byproduct of the deal. It was a load-bearing wall. The whole structure depended on nobody outside the room knowing what was in it. Between the Red Line Agreement and the Achnacarry Agreement, both signed in 1928, the global oil order had been fully structured. 7 major companies would dominate it. They would come to be known as the Seven Sisters. And the system they built was not just an economic arrangement. It was a form of governance, one that operated without elections, without accountability, and without borders. Stay with me, because understanding the sisters is the only way to understand everything that happened after. There was one more mechanism the sisters used to maintain control, and it was elegant in its cruelty. The companies kept all exploration data secret. If your surveys showed oil under a particular patch of Saudi or Iraqi ground, that information belonged to the company, not to the country whose land it was on. Governments had no way to know how much oil they actually had. Together, they controlled the exploration, production, refining, transportation, and pricing of the majority of the world's oil supply. Every stage of the chain, every barrel from the ground to the pump, they owned it. To understand what that control actually meant, consider pricing. Before the Seven Sisters, the price of oil was determined by market forces, by individual negotiations between producers and buyers. After the Sisters, the price was set by the companies. They called it the posted price, a fixed reference price that all transactions were indexed to. Governments of oil-producing countries received royalties calculated from the posted price. But the Sisters determined what the posted price was. It was a system designed to ensure the producers always received less than the oil was actually worth. There was one more mechanism the Sisters used to maintain control, and it was elegant in its cruelty. The companies kept all exploration data secret. If your surveys showed oil under a particular patch of Saudi or Iraqi ground, that information belonged to the company, not to the country whose land it was on. Governments had no way to know how much oil they actually had, which meant they had no way to negotiate from a position of knowledge. You cannot demand your fair share of something when only your counterpart knows how much there is. By the 1940s, the Seven Sisters' control was essentially total. They produced 85% of the world's oil outside the United States and Soviet Union. They owned the pipelines, the tankers, and the refineries that processed it. They negotiated directly with governments as near-sovereign entities. And they did all of this largely in secret, their internal agreements classified, their pricing mechanisms opaque, their exploration data proprietary. If this sounds like a government, it was. It just didn't have a flag. There is one more thing you need to know before we move forward. The Seven Sisters were not acting against the interests of their governments. They were acting as extensions of their governments. When British Petroleum negotiated oil concessions in the Gulf, Whitehall was in the room, just not visibly. When Standard Oil secured access in Saudi Arabia, Washington knew. The line between corporate interest and national interest had disappeared. Oil policy was foreign policy, and foreign policy was oil policy. The system held for almost 50 years through the Great Depression, through WE, through the Korean War, through the birth of television and the jet age and the space race. The Seven Sisters ran the world's oil, but holding a system together across 50 years requires constant maintenance. And maintenance means suppressing anything that threatens it. The first major threat came from Iran, and the man who posed it was Mohammad Mosaddegh. Mosaddegh was Iran's democratically elected prime minister. In 1951, he did something the Seven Sisters had designed their entire system to prevent. He nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the British company that had controlled Iranian oil since before WI. In a single parliamentary vote, he transferred control of Iranian oil to the Iranian state. Britain immediately imposed an economic blockade. The U.S. initially hesitated, but what happened next reveals exactly how the system protected itself. By 1953, Mosaddegh was gone. The CIA and British intelligence, in an operation called Ajax, organized a coup. They paid Iranian military officers and hired mobs to destabilize Tehran. They spread disinformation, they manufactured a crisis, and they restored the Shah of Iran, a monarch who would, conveniently, give the oil companies their concessions back. This is documented, declassified. It is not disputed by any credible historian. The man who built the CIA's covert action capability for this operation was Allen Dulles. The same Allen Dulles who, 30 years earlier as a young lawyer, had argued America's way into Middle Eastern oil in the first place. The restoration of the Shah and the oil concessions that followed revealed the full logic of the Seven Sisters system. Oil-producing nations were not sovereign in any meaningful sense over their own resources. Their governments could be removed if they asserted that sovereignty too effectively. And the infrastructure of that removal, the covert action capability of the CIA, had been built by a man whose first job had been to get American companies into Middle Eastern oil. The line from 1921 to 1953 is straight. Mosaddegh was put under house arrest, where he remained until his death in 1967. The Shah ruled Iran for another 26 years, supported by American money and arms, until 1979, when the Islamic Revolution removed him. The revolution that created the modern Iranian state, that made Iran America's central adversary in the Middle East, that shapes every U.S.-Iran confrontation to this day, began as a reaction to the 1953 coup, which was a reaction to oil nationalization, which was a reaction to the Seven Sisters concession terms. Pull on any thread, and you find oil at the end of it. By 1960, the producing nations had had enough. The Seven Sisters had cut the posted price of oil unilaterally without consulting the governments of the countries whose oil they were selling. For countries like Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, and Kuwait, this was a direct cut to their national revenue. No warning, no negotiation, just a lower number appearing on the price sheets the sisters controlled. The response was OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, founded in Baghdad in September 1960. The West largely dismissed OPEC at first. An American diplomat described it as a toothless paper tiger. The Seven Sisters continued to set prices, continued to control production, continued to manage the system as they always had. What they didn't see, or chose not to see, was that OPEC was a long-term project. It was building institutional capacity, shared data, and most importantly, a common front. 13 years after its founding, OPEC would not only have teeth, it would use them. In 1973, the Yom Kippur War gave OPEC its moment. When the U.S. moved to resupply Israel, Arab OPEC members announced a production cut and an embargo against Western nations supporting Israel. Oil prices went from $3 a barrel to $11 in months. Americans waited in line for hours at gas stations. European governments banned Sunday driving. The system the Seven Sisters had built, the cheap, reliable, Western-controlled oil supply that had powered 30 years of post-war prosperity, had cracked open for the first time. What happened after 1973 is the story we'll cover in depth in Episode 5. But here is what matters for today's episode. The 1973 embargo did not destroy the Seven Sisters. It accelerated their replacement. Within 10 years, the producing nations had nationalized most of the sisters' assets in their countries. Saudi Aramco, which had been owned by American companies, was brought fully under Saudi state control by 1980. The companies didn't disappear. They moved downstream into refining, distribution, and new exploration outside the red line. But the age of the cartel was over. 50 years. That is how long the system built in a Scottish castle and secured with a red line on a map actually held. From 1928 to the late 1970s, 7 companies, answerable primarily to their shareholders and their governments, not to the nations whose resources they extracted, shaped the energy destiny of the entire modern world. The Middle East you see today in all its complexity and conflict was configured by those decisions, and the companies that made them are still operating. They just have different names now. There is a direct line from the Achnacarry Agreement of 1928 to every major oil crisis you have ever heard of. The 1973 embargo was OPEC using the same structural logic the sisters had used against them, controlling supply to control price. The 2003 Iraq War involved a debate documented in declassified records about oil concession structures. The Iran nuclear negotiations have always been inseparable from the question of Iranian oil sanctions. The instrument changes. The underlying logic does not. There is also a question that this episode raises which we need to sit with. What responsibility do Western governments bear for the system the sisters built? These were not rogue companies operating against the wishes of their governments. They were instruments of government policy, officially supported, diplomatically protected, and covertly defended when necessary, as Iran in 1953 demonstrates. When oil-producing nations demanded their fair share and were removed from power for it, that was a government decision, not a corporate one. Here is what changed, and why it matters for today. When the producing nations nationalized their oil in the 1970s, they didn't end the Western oil system. They changed the terms of it. Saudi Arabia took ownership of its oil, but then agreed to price it in US dollars, recycle the profits into US Treasury bonds, and maintain a strategic partnership with Washington. That deal, the Petrodollar system, replaced the Seven Sisters as the mechanism of control. It is the subject of Episode 5. But understand this, the logic of Achnacarry and the logic of the Petrodollar are the same logic. Only the instrument changed. In Episode 3, we go to WE, where the oil system built in the 1920s met its first real stress test in combat. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor because America cut off its oil. Germany drove towards Stalingrad not to defeat Russia, but to reach the Caucasus oil fields. The Allies won because they controlled the supply. 6 out of every 7 barrels used to fight that war came from American wells. The Seven Sisters didn't just shape geopolitics, they decided who could fight, and for how long. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The story doesn't end here, it evolves. And the next chapter is the most explosive one yet.